Welcome, everybody, to Sunday Morning Science. John Perry here. Today I'm very excited about my guest. I have Dr. Donald Moss, who's going to be here with us. And before I introduce him and introduce him to you, I want to talk a little bit about today's topic. It's how to distinguish between real medicine and snake oil. So fake medicine that someone might be selling you, either because they're just trying to make a profit off of you and take advantage of you, or because someone genuinely thinks that there's an actual treatment for a disease that mainstream medicine is not yet clued into. Almost all of us, at some point in our lives, we will be diagnosed, if you live long enough, you'll be diagnosed with some sort of a disorder or disease that there's no good treatment for. So maybe there's no treatment for it at all, or maybe there is a treatment, but the treatment is absolutely horrible. And if not you, someone that you love, and especially this is especially traumatic if it's your kid, And when we get in these situations, a lot of times we become desperate. There's this beautiful quote by comedian Tim Minchin. He says, "Do you know what they call alternative medicine that's been proved to work? It's called medicine." And that statement it's pretty hilarious when you're not sick, or when you're sick and there is an unavailable treatment for whatever it is that you have. But when you're in this desperate situation where modern medicine does not have an option for you, things like that, the kind of the punchiness and the comedy behind those statements, it fades away pretty quickly. And all throughout history, this has been a problem. I've been reading this book on the Black Plague called The Black Death, and if you've been watching this show regularly, you've heard me talk a lot about the Black Plague, and I just wanted to read to you here what people were doing during the desperate times of the plague, because we had no clue. For hundreds of years, we had no clue how to treat this horrible disease that was just wiping out populations. And so all sorts of different treatments and remedies were invented. And there's a whole chapter just on plague remedies here. And there are dozens of just crazy things that people were doing, but I want to read to you a couple of the craziest. This is what the doctors were doing before they go out in the morning to go treat their patients. They would take their own urine, and this is actually the night before. They would take their own urine, put it in a glazed pot, and boil it until it evaporated to a salt. After this, they take a good knife point full of the salt on a piece of bread which has been dipped in sweet oil and eat it early in the morning on an empty stomach. They then drink a good draught of herb wine, and when in contact with their patients, they chew a bit of plaguewort. So, I don't know if you've ever peed on a fire, but boiling urine in your house would be absolutely horrible, and they were doing it every day. Drinking urine salt, or eating urine salts. And then another really interesting one. So that first one is like a home remedy. So obviously no one's trying to make money off of that. There's no snake oil salesman involved there. This is just a treatment that people really thought worked, and so they were doing it. Medical professionals were doing this. And then you've got some things that, clever marketers were taking advantage of this situation. And we have here, this is when Henry II was trying to expand his empire. So his army, they got sick with the plague. It says, "The plague broke out in his army, and the leaders as well as the sick attendants were said to have protected themselves by wearing hollowed out hazelnuts filled with live mercury around their necks." And so you have all sorts of, jewelry makers and miners who were finding different jewels and emeralds, and they would claim that these substances, in this case mercury, but also there's a lot of examples of different jewelry and stuff that people would use, and they would say that this will protect you from the plague. And so you have just this insane amount of confusion. On top of that, you have people exploiting those who are frightened to make a living. And my guest today, Dr. Donald Moss, let me introduce you to him. Hello, Donald.
Hello, nice to be here.
Don Moss, he has spent his career, or a healthy chunk of his career, trying to figure out which medicines actually work, which things As Tim Minchin says here, uh, what do you call alternative medicine that works, that's been proved to work? You call it medicine. And Donald Moss is one of these people who actually does the research to figure out if something is medicine or not. And so I'm very happy to have you on the show today.
Well, thank you. I'm very much looking forward to this. This is
Yeah,
very interesting. Thanks.
yeah. I I think we just read some of these crazy remedies that have been used in the past that were unproven and ended up being proven not to work. So putting mercury around your neck, eating your own urine. But there's actually weirder things that have been proven to work. So there's actually I was just going over some things this week. There's several medicines that come from snake venom. There's
Oh, yes.
there's a medicine right now in trial that it's a painkiller that comes from tick saliva. Um, Penicillin comes from mold and so on. And then you have found some really interesting things in your work. We were just talking about this before the show. You want to tell us about your research with Tourette's syndrome?
Well, yes. And I want to emphasize that a lot of the things that we do have in modern medicine have come from, well, of course, have come from natural products because that's basically all people had to start with.
Right.
And I want to go back to some of the oldest Western literature. I want to go back to Homer's Odyssey. And as our viewers may know, Odysseus was one of the heroes of the Trojan War, and this was about 800 BC. And on the way home after the Trojan War, Odysseus and his crew were captured by a sorceress named Circe on an island. And they just got detoured on the way home. And Circe served his crew a posset. They called it a posset.
Mm-hmm.
And his crew became incapacitated, hallucinated, forgot their homeland, and they came under the power of Circe. And Odysseus was back on the ship. And when the messenger came and told him about the crew being captured by Circe, Odysseus started up the hill to Circe's lair to rescue his crew. And on the way up the hill through the forest, he was interrupted by a messenger of the gods. Mm-hmm. A guy named Hermes, a messenger of the gods, appeared before him and gave him a black twisted root. And he told him that it came from a flower that had a white blossom and it grew in the dark of the forest, and to take it home and make a tea and drink it before he went up to Circe's poison. So he did that, and he went up there, and Circe gave him her posset, intending to take control of Odysseus. And Odysseus was completely immune to it. Odysseus fought with Circe, depending on which version of the story you like to hear. Anyway, he freed his crew and then continued on his way home. Mm-hmm. Well, the importance of this is that Circe's posset contained the atropine and scopolamine, which are belladonna alkaloids that cause amnesia and hallucinations.
Yeah.
And they're in modern day Jimson weed that people use for abuse to get high and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But what Odysseus had as a protection against that was what we now call Homer's Molly. It contained a compound called galantamine, and galantamine reverses the effect of scopolamine and atropine. And galantamine today is used as a treatment for Alzheimer's disease. It's a cholinesterase inhibitor mm-hmm. for Alzheimer's disease. And I work on Alzheimer's disease also.
Yeah.
But my interest in alternative medicines like the cannabinoids came from an original research that was done by a guy named David Janowski. Mm-hmm. David Janowski had the hypothesis that the high that you get out of marijuana And remember, this is in the 1980s, so it was before we understood that cannabinoids have their own neurotransmitters and their own receptors in the brain.
Yeah.
David Janowski thought that it was producing its effect by interfering with acetylcholine in the brain. And so he thought, well, if you get high by blocking the effect of acetylcholine in the brain with marijuana, then I can correct the marijuana high by giving you a drug that enhances acetylcholine. It was a little study of mechanism. If you believe that it blocks something in the brain, then give a drug that's known to reverse it. And so he was at Vanderbilt University at the time, and he talked a couple of graduate students in pharmacology to go out and get really stoned and then come into the student health center to be treated for marijuana intoxication.
Yeah.
And they did, and they came in, and when they were in there, they were laughing and carrying on. And by the way, this is all published in the British Journal of Pharmacology in about, 1975.
Yeah.
But anyway, he then hooked up the students with an IV and gave them a drug called physostigmine. And physostigmine is a cholinesterase inhibitor.
Mm-hmm.
And so it stops the breakdown of acetylcholine. And what it does is it amplifies acetylcholine. It makes it increase in concentration quickly. And if marijuana is producing its high, by blocking acetylcholine, this should reverse it.
Right.
Well, it turned out it did reverse it terribly, dramatically. The students went from laughing and carrying on, talking and everything, to sobbing.
Really?
And saying they didn't know. If they didn't know that the drug was producing this depression, they didn't know how they would keep from killing themselves and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so David Janowski, it took him about 30 minutes. And I have joked with him, that's probably the amount of time that it took him to go call his attorney and ask what he needed to do about this situation, because it was not an approved drug trial
wow.
by the FDA. It was just an informal thing. But then he went back and he gave him the atropine. This is the drug that I was telling you that Circe had in her posset.
Yeah.
That would reverse the effect of the physostigmine.
Right.
And he gave them atropine and they recovered. And they were then back to normal. The whole thing took a couple of hours.
Yeah.
And so I had talked to David Janowski about this, and I was wondering how that could work. Maybe this was a new way to understand how the brain controls mood. Right. Because none of the drugs that we have today act on acetylcholine. None of the approved drugs act on acetylcholine. They work on dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin primarily.
You're talking about the approved drugs for like depression and so on.
That's right, the approved drugs for depression. And what's interesting about them is that you have to take them 2 or 3 weeks before they begin to have their therapeutic effect.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, boy, this is really close to the mechanism in the brain, because the effect happened in a matter of 30 minutes.
Right.
It was a dramatic effect. And so that started me off on studying how marijuana worked in the brain. I wanted to understand that.
Mm-hmm.
And that led me down a long path. I never did discover how marijuana affects mood. But along the way, I did an experiment where I was giving physostigmine and THC. I got the pure THC from the National Institute on Drug Abuse and did this in rats. Mm-hmm. And I was looking for something where marijuana would do one thing, and then you give them physostigmine and it would reverse it. Mm-hmm. And I was giving rats THC, and I guess they enjoyed the experiment pretty well. I don't know. You can't tell. Yeah. But anyway, I was then giving them physostigmine to see if it would reverse the effect of marijuana. And what we were doing in rats is THC does have an analgesic effect. It does reduce the perception of pain. And so we had rats that were stoned on THC, and then we would give them a little test we would induce some pain in their paw.
Yeah.
And then we could measure how much they licked their paw and that kind of thing, whether they could walk on it. And then we gave them physostigmine.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a student running this experiment, and a guy named Richard Johnson. And one day Richard Johnson came into my office and he said, "You better come and look at these rats. You better come and look at this experiment."
Mm-hmm.
And I went in there and looked at these rats, and they were just frozen. They were little statues.
Huh.
They did not move. And remember, they had a painful stimulus on their paw, and they weren't doing anything. And so I took the rat and I turned it over on its back, and the rat would right itself, which meant that they were aware. They weren't just blacked out. And they'd frozen. And that was totally unexpected. That's what's called serendipity.
Yeah. And
so I began to study that, and that led me eventually to propose in about 1982 that THC would be useful, marijuana would be useful for the treatment of Tourette's syndrome.
Okay.
The reason these are related is because Tourette's syndrome is a motor disorder. You have people that have normal intellect, absolutely normal intellect. They're just perfectly all right, except they have these involuntary movements and they shout obscenities and they have no control over it. And I proposed that if you had a drug that would slow down motor movement, in other words, in the rats, it really slowed them down to where they actually stopped, that it would have a therapeutic effect in a disorder where there's too much movement.
Right.
And I went to Australia and gave a paper on that down in Australia, and it hit the Australian press. And there was a guy in Australia who had Tourette's syndrome. He was a young man, about 30 years old, and he had been retired by the Australian government and given a pension because he couldn't work.
Right.
And Tourette's syndrome is very uncomfortable because people avoid you, you can't interact, you know, it's a brutal kind of a disorder.
Right.
And this guy went out in the back country, out in the bush, and he read that in the paper. He smoked a pipe of marijuana, and his tics went away, and he went back into society and went back to work. And so anyway, the point of this almost endless story, please forgive me, is that there are beneficial effects that come from unexpected places, natural products that are a source of real medicine.
Right. It has marijuana now been approved for Tourette's, or is there a recommended way to take it now for Tourette's? Has that matured into an actual?
It's not approved. I don't believe it's approved. There was a product, a cannabinoid product that was approved. I can't remember the name of it. It's not widely used now. But marijuana could be used for Tourette's, either taking it orally, which is probably the best way to take it. The downside of that is it takes a little bit more with a edible marijuana, but the advantage is that it lasts longer. Another case of this marijuana and Tourette's was a kid in Arizona who had Tourette's syndrome, and it was refractory to every treatment. And he was having trouble, but he was a sophomore in high school, and he went out one Christmas holiday with his friends, and after he and his friends went out, his Tourette's syndrome, Tourette's symptoms went away. And it turns out it was because he was smoked marijuana. And he actually found that he could smoke marijuana on Sunday night and be okay till Thursday, smoke on Thursday, and he'd be fine till Sunday. And he smoked twice a week. And he graduated from high school, went on to college. And last time I heard from him, he had graduated from college and he was married and getting along just fine. But you can eat it, you can smoke it. It's not approved primarily because in the United States, it's still illegal.
Right. Now what you've told us here are different stories of individuals taking marijuana and helping with their Tourette's, and that's very similar to like the stories that you'll find in the Black Plague, where people are, they're taking their urine. There's a guy who drinks 3 handfuls of urine a day, and it allows him to not get the Black Plague. So how do you go from these individual stories, which might be coincidental or there might be an actual effect there? How do you go from there to actually demonstrating that this particular molecule works or this particular drug works for this particular disease, and then getting approval for it through the FDA?
I am so happy that you asked that, because I often say that the plural of anecdote is not data.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the internet and the literature is replete with before and after photographs, testimonials.
Yeah.
And you should always be suspicious of that.
Right.
Very much so, because of these anecdotes, and they were published in journals.
Right.
I was telling you about Hemmings and Yellow Lees published the article about the Australian guy that went out into the bush, and the doctors actually examined him and documented it against his medical history. But because of those stories, there was a group in Germany then that ran some experiments on Tourette syndrome, and they did not find a big effect, not too big. It seems that the cannabinoids affect motor behavior more than the mental behavior of having compulsions and shouting obscenities and that kind of thing. It was not a big effect, and you should always say, is it a big effect? I get so annoyed when people don't run the experiments that you're talking about, John.
Yeah.
When I talk about an experiment, I'm talking about you get a group of people that are pretty much a homogeneous group of patients that have the disorder, and you randomly divide them into 2 or more groups, and in a blind fashion. And by that I mean nobody knows who gets the drug and who does not get the drug. Right. Not even the people who are running the experiment. It's done by a third party. You get coded vials. You can't tell what's in there. And then you analyze the data, and the effect has to be big.
Yeah.
It has to be big enough that it's a convincing effect. Because when we take medicine as a patient, if I went out today to take medicine as a patient, I would expect it to work in me. Right. In other words, I expect it to work on an N of 1. And I expect it to work in most of the people that have a group of 10, let's say. We have a good expectation that it'll work. I get so annoyed when I read experiments where they have 3,000 patients in a clinical trial, for example, in Alzheimer's disease, another area in which I work. Biogen, this last spring, had a new drug for Alzheimer's disease, and the results were so dismal at a midpoint that they said that they were going to pull it and they were not going to seek FDA approval. And then somebody went back and looked at the data, and you may recall this scandal, and then they said, oh, no, it works. We're going to go to the FDA. We're going to work it out. Well, it might be statistically significant. If you have 10,000 people in a trial, 3,000 people in a trial, maybe it works a little bit.
Right.
And maybe it's enough to be statistical, but that does not mean it's clinical. And it'll work in some people and not others. And so if you're looking to evaluate a substance, you see some claim on the internet, and you get all these testimonials, and they may actually have run an experiment. Look carefully at this experiment. Was it in patients? Did it make a big difference? Is it something that's likely to help people?
Yeah. Yeah. So the reason that I first got a hold of you, well, recently got a hold of you, for those just so everybody knows our history together, I met Don Moss probably, was it 5 years ago or so?
Oh, I think it was more than that.
Was it?
It was 2010 when I was working with Jim Somerton,
Yeah,
and we were.
yeah. Yeah, so you were working on this Alzheimer's treatment that needed funding from investors so it could go into clinical trials, right? And so I helped you guys do some marketing for that. I did an animation for you guys, and back then you and I had lots of conversations about kind of the alternative medicine and how things go from you know kind of fairy tale drug treatments and alternative medicine into real medicine. And one of the things that you told me, I don't know if you remember the quote, but it was, if a drug doesn't have a side effect, it doesn't have a real effect. And that stuck with me for a long time. And you had also mentioned that you were studying marijuana for Tourette's. And just recently, here in Canada, there was a paper published saying that marijuana might be useful in the treatment of COVID-19. And my wife, she's a nurse, and her fellow nurses were super excited about this and like, oh, people can treat COVID with marijuana, and a bunch of people they just started smoking weed to treat to protect themselves against COVID. And I sent you the paper, and I was like, does this look legitimate to you? Does this look like a serious thing that people should be considering? And your response was, well, no, and especially not just to smoke it, because if you look at the research, they had a very specific strain of marijuana. It was not high in THC. It was high in what's the other one in THC that's
Cannabidiol.
yeah.
It's CBD.
Yeah.
Cannabidiol.
And their trial was very, very preliminary, and it was taking it orally. And there's actually problems if smoking, of course, causes mild inflammation anytime you smoke anything. And there's actually been problems here with people that are smoking a lot, having symptoms that they think are COVID symptoms because they're having trouble breathing, they're having swelling in the respiratory tract. And so the heavy smoking is actually causing problems for doctors because it's clogging up the testing facilities. This isn't happening so much anymore. People aren't so scared of COVID as they were initially, so people aren't getting these false scares so much anymore. But yeah, this excitement around marijuana turned into an excitement around smoking it, which was not at all what the doctors were even recommending, and their research was extremely preliminary. And so it's kind of like people were told what they wanted to hear. Smoking marijuana cures you of this disease, and that's what they heard, but that's not what was actually stated at all. And it's just amazing how this information gets out into the public, and as people are sharing it person to person, as the media reports on it, things just balloon out of control, and you get these really weird, inappropriate explanations of how to treat this new disease, this COVID-19. And it's really spectacular to watch this happen. And I was glad to be able to send that to you and pretty much get your immediate response as, no, this is not this is not what people are saying it is.
Yes, and I'm glad you sent that along. And in defense of the authors that wrote this paper, and I happen to have it here with me today.
Yeah.
In defense of the authors, they don't make that claim
right
at all. And it is a scientifically done paper, and it's done in cell culture, and they do get some tiny effects. I don't know if you can tell the difference between the height of the bars in there.
Yeah.
But that's not a very big effect, and it's in cell culture. And what's interesting to me when you read the paper, that it worked in oral tissue. One cannabinoid worked in oral tissue, another one worked in lung tissue, and a different one worked, in nasal tissue and that kind of thing. So if you were going to smoke marijuana to block they were trying to block the receptor,
Right.
the ACE2 receptor, which is the doorway by which COVID enters the cell.
Yeah.
If you were going to smoke marijuana to block that, which cannabinoid, which strain of marijuana would you smoke? And secondly, the effect here is so small and it's in cell culture that any idea that this is a basis for using it in humans to avoid COVID is unfounded. You
Right.
know, it's a good example of maybe pseudoscience. No, this is good science, but it's misinterpreted in the internet into thinking that it could actually be used. You know, you might as well put mercury in a thing around your neck for COVID, as far as that goes.
Right, right. So what you're saying is that they did good research and they recommend in there that they don't recommend using it. That what they say is that this should be looked into. They say we're seeing that it has this effect in cell culture, and we think that people should look into this. More research should be done on this, and
Yes.
and because it's marijuana and people like to smoke marijuana, the media just took it over and just blew it out of proportion. And that's got to be really frustrating for. I mean, because you've actually studied medical marijuana, I'm sure you're aware of the huge biases you have on the pro marijuana and the anti marijuana groups, where it becomes super hard to do your job, right?
Well, it becomes very political
Right,
for no reason, really.
right,
I often like to say that if THC had been discovered in a laboratory with somebody working on a problem, and THC does have some very good medical uses.
right.
For example, it's wonderful to treat nausea, vomiting, and stuff. It's not the best drug for that, but it's very effective at it.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, it's good for Tourette syndrome. It's good for other things as well. It's good for epilepsy. Some
Mm-hmm.
of the cannabinoids are well established, but if it had been discovered in a laboratory for one of those uses, it would have been an approved pharmaceutical.
Yeah,
But it was discovered on the street,
right.
and therefore you have a drug that's effective and the side effect is desirable. Well, if the side effect of marijuana was that you were miserable, then it would have been approved.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that I think I believe that that's changing with marijuana now. I mean, here in Canada, it's now legal for recreational use and medical use. In Oregon, it's legal now for I'm from Oregon. It's now legal there for medical and recreational. So it looks like that might change in the future. Do you have any idea as to when that might change at a national level so that we can really start using this as an actual medicinal drug?
Well, I would like to say that in the United States, and I'm in Colorado now, and Colorado was one of the first states to begin to legalize recreational use of marijuana. And fortunately, the medical use of marijuana has been approved by states in
Mm-hmm.
various states, like Oregon, very forward looking also. But at the national level, and the national level controls the FDA, of course. At the national level, I don't know that there's any real movement to
Not really.
legalize the use of marijuana, uh, especially recreationally. But they might eventually get something in medicinal uses. But right now, it's a Schedule One drug,
Right.
I believe. It used to be a Schedule One drug, which means that it had no medical use whatever, and that it was in the highest category of risk for people.
Right.
And of course, it's a good example. We know very well that the risk of using marijuana is relatively low. It's lower than drinking alcohol. It's lower than
Right.
most approved drugs, actually.
Right. Yeah. It really is. It's it's kind of a tragic story with that. Like it got associated with. When was it first illegalized? Do you know when it was put on Schedule One?
Well, no, I don't. But it was in the 1930s and
Yeah.
1940s that was a lot of scare about marijuana, and then there was a drug act that resulted from not just from marijuana, but from a lot of things that came along in the 1930s or 40s.
Yeah. And that was yeah, I remember having read that back in the 30s people thought it would make you dangerous, it would make you violent. And then of course it was associated with the hippie movement in the 60s. And so it's had all these weird stigmas attached to it, which has made it really problematic for doing research on it and so on. Uh, right now we've got this COVID crisis, and there's just everything you can imagine that people are saying you can use to treat COVID. We had, for the first time in my life, and I don't know if this is the first time in your life too, but we had politicized treatments. So hydroxychloroquine was being used by Republicans and being rejected by Democrats as a treatment. You have, Democrats wear masks, Republicans don't. There's, it's the weirdest. I've never seen anything like this. Have you ever seen anything like this?
No, but I think it's a symptom of our time. I have never seen our nation so divided and so politicized before in my life.
To where it actually goes down into medical treatments of a disease. That is absolutely amazing to me.
It is.
I do see that in reading about the Black Plague. I do see that was happening. Different governments would give different recommendations like about food that you should be eating, whether or not you do quarantines or other different things, whether or not you pray, or I think it was Italy, their official medical recommendation was to spend time every day looking at gold and silver for the pleasure that it gives you, and it will help you stop from getting the disease. Things were very political back then, and I think maybe this is a symptom of a new disease that no one knows how to treat and is having a huge effect on the culture, or maybe it's a symptom of just the left and right are so dramatically different now than they have been in the past. But it's really something amazing to see. I'd like to talk with you now about your work with Alzheimer's, but maybe before we dig into that, just talking about the FDA in general. So again, kind of going back to this Tim Minchin quote, what do you call alternative medicine that's been proved to work? You call it medicine. And in America, what that usually means is that a drug has been approved by the FDA, a drug or a treatment has been approved by the FDA and is now being used in hospitals and being given out by doctors. And what are your general thoughts on the FDA? Is the FDA really helping us avoid snake oil and other, just lame medical treatments? And what do you see as the pros and cons of this FDA culture that we have in the United States?
Well, yes, the FDA is protecting us against snake oil treatments. And if the FDA were not keeping the gate on those, there are just hundreds or thousands of people that have snake oil treatments that have no basis in fact.
Right.
They'll be happy to go out and sell you all kinds of bogus stuff. And in fact, you can see it in the Sunday paper, an insert in the Sunday paper today.
Yeah.
They'll sell supplements and they'll make outrageous claims, and they'll have a 2-page ad, and they'll have before and after pictures. And it's all very convincing until you realize that there's only one person or a group of people that are pushing this one item. Nobody else is. And I would like to say that if you hit on something that works and you can demonstrate it, the first thing that happens is a lot of other people generally will get on the bandwagon. And if you have something, they will push it forward. They will find an alternative structure of the same thing, and they'll make it medicine and they'll make money.
Right.
But the FDA does a good job of protecting us against a lot of things, although you should read every claim that you see and see whether it says this was not approved by the FDA for the treatment, diagnosis, or anything else of a disease, that means it's not FDA approved, even though they claim it's a supplement and they have all kinds of data. The problem with the FDA is that it has fossilized the drug approval mechanism in the United States to the point that it's enormously expensive. It'll take $500 million to get a drug for Alzheimer's approved at a minimum. It'll
500 million? Is that a normal cost for any drug to get approved by the FDA?
I think Alzheimer's is a little higher than most other drugs because proving efficacy in Alzheimer's disease is more difficult.
Okay.
You know, if you have a treatment for some short-term illness, you can tell in a matter of a few months or a few years whether or not it's going to work or not. And it's real easy to prove. If it's for a broken leg, you can tell whether the leg heals very quickly and take an x-ray. With Alzheimer's, it's a very slow process, and you have to follow. The clinical trials have to go for years, and you know, you're studying memory, and memory might get better and might get worse. And having run an Alzheimer's disease two clinical trials, I can tell you that it's very difficult because of the variability in memory.
Yeah.
Even a demented Alzheimer's person will have a good day when they can remember something and a bad day when they can't. And so if you measure them on one day, it looks like the drug worked, and on another day it didn't. And you know, it's very difficult. So, and it's hard to tell with Alzheimer's because in the old days anyway, they're getting better at it now, but you couldn't even tell who was for sure an Alzheimer's patient until they went to autopsy.
Oh,
Now we have a better way of doing it. But when you can't tell whether your patient has the disease or not, you have people who don't have Alzheimer's disease in the Alzheimer's group, which means you've mixed in control patients in the Alzheimer's group. And in the control group that you didn't think had Alzheimer's, they do. And so it's almost impossible. So anyway, that makes the trials really expensive.
Just to be really clear here, getting FDA approval isn't expensive because you have to pay off some shady government official. It's expensive because doing the research is expensive, right?
That's right.
Right.
But it also probably pays to pay off the officials. But anyway, that's not what makes it run into the 500 million. And also it takes years to run these things. And remember, in the United States and in most countries of the world, the patent that you get for your drug is only good for 17 years from the day that you file it.
17 years, okay.
Yes. A very recent study 5 or 6 years ago of drugs that were approved, somebody went back and studied what was the amount of time between when you got the patent and when the drug was approved by the FDA. Now remember, it's only for those drugs that got approval. And I'd like to come back and talk about a lot of drugs that don't get approved and why they don't get approved. But it took 13.9 years on average from the day you got a patent until it was approved.
Oh, wow.
Well, let's just round it up and say 14 years. That only gives you 3 years after you get approval to recover the $500 million you've spent along the way.
Right.
So the FDA makes it very expensive and makes it very long. So, John,
let me just ask one more question here on the the patent stuff here. So, when your patent runs out, you can see, obviously you can still keep selling your drug and making money, but once the patent runs out, you have to publish the formula for the drug so that other manufacturers can make it too? Is that how that works?
Well, when you file for the patent and your patent is issued, the drug and all of the details about it become public information. So anybody can do it from the date of your patent.
But legally they can't sell it.
That's right.
Right.
When the patent expires, then a generic drug company can go to the FDA and they can make a very simple, inexpensive application. and they can use the data that were supplied by the original company, and they can say, look, all of these data show that it's safe and effective, and they put in this abbreviated application and it's approved. Before the patent expires, the FDA will not allow them to refer to the other company's data.
Right.
So to get it approved, they would have to run their own clinical trial, and they cannot sell it because the patent will bar selling it for that use. They cannot sell it for the approved use until the patent expires.
Right. So if you have a really complicated molecule that not many people can make, you might not have to worry so much about the patent running out because you're still going to be the only one making that drug for years to come. So you can earn back that $500 million. But if you have a really simple molecule that a lot of companies are already making for whatever reason, and you just found that it works to treat a disease, if you have to be really careful because as soon as that patent runs out, someone else is going to make it way cheaper than you, and you will no longer make any money. You might not make any money after that. So for an investor, if this drug costs $500 million and you want to invest in it, there's almost no incentive if the molecule is simple to invest in it, because even if it works, it doesn't matter. You're not going to be able to make a return on that investment. So that's the big problem that the FDA causes for people who are even who have discovered a drug that works. Sometimes it is not profitable to go through the process of getting it approved.
That's right. There are a lot of drugs that fall off of what they call the patent cliff.
Yeah.
They may be wonderful drugs that really work, and the FDA holds them up so long and makes it so expensive that the manufacturer realizes that they're only going to have 2 years left when the patent expires, and they'll drop a perfectly good drug.
Right.
There are excellent drugs that are sitting on the shelf and they're not used because of patents.
Yeah. And because this is common knowledge now, there's also tons of snake oil salesmen that say that their drug is one of those, or their molecule is one of those, and they use that as an excuse. So you've got the truth of this. This is a real thing that really happens. You have good drugs that are not approved by the FDA because of money, and then you have these salesmen that are lying to patients saying that their particular molecule is one of those. So there's just mass confusion for consumers. Like, how are we supposed to wade through this? It's very difficult.
Well, theoretically, if a drug is a drug,
right,
and falls into the category of a drug, if it's not approved by the FDA, you can't sell it.
Yeah.
What happens is they say, well, this is a supplement.
Right.
Or this is a nutritional supplement. And that's where the confusion comes in. Supplements are not regulated, and people can sell those as treatments, etc., when they don't work.
Well, okay, so I know you had something else you wanted to get to, but just how does that work? Like, let's say that I have a drug I want to go on trial, and it's going to be too expensive to go through trial. Can I just call it a supplement then? Even if it's like some molecule that I'm manufacturing in a lab?
Theoretically, according to the law, no, you can't just call it a supplement. The FDA has definitions of what is a drug, and if it falls into that category, then you cannot just call it a supplement. I have a drug that's in limbo. It was patented. The patent has expired. It really works. It's wonderful, but I can't go out and sell it and call it a supplement because it's chemical and it's not like anything that's natural. It doesn't supplement any, normal kind of process that you would think of as a supplement. So it's a drug.
So to call something a supplement, it has to be like from an actual like food item or plant or animal. Is that right?
Well, yes, I think so.
Okay.
I think so, but it's a really complicated legal definition.
Okay.
Anyway, a drug does not count as a supplement generally. If you went out and sold it as a supplement, for example, lecithin, I could go out and sell lecithin as a supplement, and lecithin might be a really reasonable supplement. It's phosphatidylcholine, and it facilitates the production of acetylcholine in the brain.
Right.
That's its mechanism of action. I could go out and sell it as a supplement. It wouldn't have to be approved as a drug.
Right.
But also, we know that lecithin, even though it has a wonderful mechanism of action that's well understood, it doesn't work. And so it would never show efficacy that the FDA would want.
Okay.
You can take all the lecithin you want to, and in fact, it's a food additive. You'd have to take a lot more of it. But lecithin would be sold as a supplement, and the reason it doesn't work is it gets metabolized into triethylamines in the blood. It makes you smell a little bit like fish, and it never makes it where it's supposed to go.
Okay.
But that would be a supplement. Let's say it didn't get inactivated.
You're saying it gets deactivated by the stomach?
Yes, in the blood, actually, in the blood. And stomach. But let's take St. John's wort. Okay. There's another example of an herb that is natural, and it does have scientifically substantiated clinical trials that shows that it raises the mood. It works as an antidepressant, and it's fairly effective. You could sell St. John's wort perhaps as a supplement. And it might not need to be approved as a drug. If you were going to refine it and you're going to manufacture the active ingredient in St. John's wort, that escapes me at the moment, I don't remember what it is, and you were going to sell it under XYZ Pharmaceuticals, you'd probably have to get approval.
Okay. So it's sounding like the legal definition of what you say is complex. It has something to do with how processed a thing is. Once you get into the very specific molecules, it becomes a drug instead of a herbal treatment or a supplement. And so, okay, yeah, that's really interesting. I had I mentioned this to you before the show. My ear doctor growing up, he ended up quitting his job. I think he had to quit his job because he got in a car wreck and the pain that he was experiencing was so intense that he ended up having to quit his job. And recently he got into a multi-level marketing scam selling this molecule or selling this supplement that cures everything. And he got a hold of me because I make these science videos. He's like, you should make a video about this supplement. It's changing the world. It'll make you live 10 years longer and reduces pain, does all this stuff. And he showed me the papers that backed up his claims. And what happened is it was a trial of this supplement on a cell culture, and it increased the cell's metabolism. It made the cells metabolize, their metabolism speed up. And I looked at what the supplement was, and it had a bunch of caffeine in it. It was like different herbs that have caffeine in them. And so I wrote him back and I said, okay, this is not showing that it cures anything. It increases the metabolism in cells, and of course it does. It has caffeine in it. And he wrote me back extremely angry. He said, I'm a doctor. You don't know what you're talking about. And it was just it was a crazy experience. And he no longer talks to me. And I've known him since I was a kid. He was like friends of our family and everything. So it's like this, yeah, these problems are very deep in our culture, and these marketing schemes are really increasing this, and this confusion between a supplement and a drug. So I just I think that was a little bit of a tangent, but I just want to point out how serious this problem is in our society here.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because that's a good example. You asked me, how can people tell the difference between snake oil and real medicine?
Right.
And generally, the line is pretty clear. Medicines are approved and manufactured and sold, and they have gone through the process where they have been shown to be effective. Mm-hmm. And the FDA is pretty rigorous about effectiveness, even though I complained earlier about them approving drugs that have little effects, but they have an effect, maybe not clinically valuable like we want it to be, but they have an effect and they're safe. But when you get a supplement or something that is being promoted by one person,
Right.
and nobody else is jumping in to run clinical trials on it, even people who oppose the idea are going to jump in and start running experiments.
Right.
And there should be a whole body of literature that show that. And there should be clinical trials. There should be people who take it.
Right.
And it should not just be testimonials. Oh, it worked. It didn't work. Like
Yeah.
I said earlier, the plural of an anecdote is not data.
Yeah.
And you can tell pretty easily, and slick presentations, hype, and appeal to authority, like, oh, this guy is a medicine on the medical faculty of XYZ faculty in New York or whatever.
Right.
You know, that's just not convincing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another. Multi-level marketing companies are really good at doing this. They will pay one doctor, hundreds of thousands of dollars to come and do a presentation about the efficacy of their herbal treatment for whatever. And then they have these big conventions, all their marketers come in there, it's a big party, you get all excited, it's almost like a religion. I actually, my first job when I actually started my career in graphic design and marketing, and my first actual professional job, I worked for a multi-level marketing company that taught people how to trade in the stock market. And I didn't really know what MLMs were all about when I first started there, but I was in the background behind all this and seeing what goes on, and it was insane. Like we had this stock market guru guy who had been sort of successful as a stock trader. Everything was exaggerated, his success, and he was used as the expert. It was just amazing. It was so dishonest, and the way that multi-level marketing works is you don't have to have a real product that actually works. People are making money basically in most cases it's a pyramid scheme where you're making money off getting more people to come sell your product with you, and you make money off their sales, but you're not actually, you don't have to have a product that works because people are excited about the get rich quick scheme. And so you can market completely bogus stuff through these. And like you said, if something works, people are going to jump on it. You don't, I think there might be some products that sell best in a multi-level marketing scheme, like maybe something that's really complicated to use. You'll have people that your friends teach you how to use it, or there's like some things that people are embarrassed to buy at a store. There's a lot of like sex toys for women are sold through MLMs, and that's probably like the most comfortable way for some women to buy these products they actually want, is their friend to come to their house and show them how they work and so on. But for the most part, these multi-level marketing things, it's to sell garbage as a get rich quick scheme, and they are just dominating my Facebook. Like all my friends from high school are, oh, let me tell you about this new product I have, and it's so obnoxious. It's yeah.
Well, my experience with multi-level marketing was when I was an undergraduate, and my wife and I were broke, living in a trailer when I was an undergraduate, and I sold Amway products. Now, Amway products, you can clean your bathroom with them and stuff. They actually work, but the way you made money was to get other people hooked on it, have parties at your house and sell them, and keep the hype up.
Yeah.
Yes, multi-level marketing works in drugs too, and the drug companies pay big names, and they become what they call thought leaders. And they go to conferences, and you're supposed to bow and wave and clap and celebrate the breakthrough. Another thing, if somebody says it's a breakthrough, that the drug is a breakthrough, it's a red flag.
Okay.
Most improvements are incremental,
right?
And one drug will be much better than the other. Sometimes there'll be a real change in the marketing, I mean, a drug will be substantially better than any others, but it's not going to be some guy on the internet telling you about it.
Right.
It's going to be published in journals, and there'll be clinical trials, and it'll be obvious.
Right. Right. Uh, well, I guess let's dive into the molecule you've been studying for Alzheimer's, which is not a treatment. It is not a cure for Alzheimer's. It doesn't even slow its physical progression, but it enables people to live longer with functioning brains when they have Alzheimer's. Let's talk about that a little bit here.
Well, first of all, I want to give an update, John.
Yeah.
10 years ago, the thinking was that these molecules would not slow down the progression of the disease.
Okay.
And in the last 3 to 5 years, there have been data that indicate these molecules do, in fact, slow down the progression of the disease. But let me back up for a moment. My drug is a cholinesterase inhibitor. Mm-hmm. And one of the problems that I've had in developing this drug is the cholinesterase inhibitors were the ones that were first introduced in the middle of the 1990s as Tacrin and donepezil and rivastigmine, and they were introduced for the treatment of dementia. Right. And dementia results from the absence of sufficient acetylcholine in the brain. Right. If you don't have enough acetylcholine in the brain, you can't remember anything. It's right. Like with Parkinson's disease, you don't have enough dopamine in the brain, then you don't get control of movement. And so they thought, well, we'll enhance acetylcholine. They introduced the cholinesterase inhibitors.
So let me just explain technically what this is doing. So you have acetylcholine, which is a molecule that your brain needs to send messages between nerves. And then you have acetylcholine esterase, which is a protein that eats acetylcholine, so that acetylcholine doesn't stay in the brain triggering nerves after they're supposed to stop being triggered. And so if you have an acetylcholine esterase inhibitor, so if you have an acetylcholine eater inhibitor, that means that less acetylcholine gets to stay in the brain longer. And so if you have a disease like Alzheimer's where you don't have enough acetylcholine, the acetylcholine esterase inhibitor helps raise your acetylcholine numbers, essentially, right?
And we should refer your viewers to the video that you made explaining how these work. Wonderful video.
I'll link to that in the video description. Yeah.
Okay, but anyway, so the cholinesterase inhibitors got sort of a bad name because theoretically they would work, and in clinical trials they will work a little bit. Here again we get to the small effect problem. They didn't make dramatic differences that they were expected to. And the reason for that is because acetylcholine also runs the intestines and the heart and other organs in the body. And so when you take a cholinesterase inhibitor to work in the brain, the first thing you know, you have overstimulation of the intestines and the stomach, and you get nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. So the question is, how badly do you want to try to remember something?
Yeah.
When you do remember it, it's mainly nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Right. So anyway, my drug avoids the nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea for reasons that are technical. But anyway, my problem is that the cholinesterase inhibitors have a bad name because they're ineffective.
Right.
And the thing that changed dramatically in 2015, 2016, and 2017 is that a group in France, now see, I'm talking about somebody else's research, not my own, so that'll tell you that it's likely to be more valid than if I were telling you about my own research. Yeah. But some people in France, in Paris, did an experiment. This is a real experiment where they took a whole group of Alzheimer's patients and they randomly divided the group into two groups. One group got a cholinesterase inhibitor called donepezil, and the other group got a placebo. And nobody knew. It was double blind, which means, that they weren't blind, but
The
They didn't
doctors,
know.
the doctors don't know who's getting the real drug, and the patients don't know who's getting the real drug.
That's right. It was double-blind, placebo-controlled, and they gave one group donepezil for a year, and the other group got placebo for a year. And at the end of the year, then they evaluated the patients. And what was astounding about this study is that donepezil treated patients actually showed a slowing of the atrophy of the cortex of Alzheimer's patients. It didn't stop it, but the big problem in Alzheimer's disease is that your brain is basically deteriorating, and you can see it physically in the MRI, and that's what they were measuring. It's not, they said it was better, and it was a bunch of hand waving, these patients were all good. But they could actually show it on the MRI, and they did the experiment again with another group of patients, and they showed that it slowed the atrophy of the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is an area of the brain that's critical to memory, absolutely critical.
Right.
If anything happens to the hippocampus, you can't remember anything.
Yeah.
Some people who know the history of psychology may remember the famous patient HM, and HM had some surgery on his hippocampus for epilepsy. And after he had surgery on his hippocampus, he couldn't remember anything.
I'm pretty sure he lives in Montreal.
I think he might, he might have. But anyway, the hippocampus is one of those key areas. Yeah. And the hippocampus atrophy was slowed. And then also the basal forebrain, another area critical to Alzheimer's disease, showed a slowing of atrophy. The reason that I'm so excited about this is that in 2014, and that's just when it was published, and nothing has changed since 2014 with regard to drugs related to amyloid. But in 2014, there was a review of all of the clinical trials on Alzheimer's disease for drugs to block amyloid. And in 2014, there were 400 clinical trials on drugs intended to block amyloid, and 0 of those trials showed any benefit for slowing the progression of Alzheimer's disease. And now, I was laughing about Biogen earlier and their amyloid drug. This year, they still have it in a clinical trial. Well, science is a data-based endeavor. Yeah. And when you have 400 trials that say that something is not working, there might be a message here.
Right.
And then you also have this class of drugs that's been poo-pooed as a fairly ineffective symptomatic treatment. And in fact, the drugs that we have are fairly ineffective and symptomatic, but they're better than the ones for amyloid.
Yeah.
And so we're really hopeful that someone will take off on the cholinesterase inhibitors now and start really studying them as a way to stop Alzheimer's.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that that this trial in France, there was an acetylcholine esterase inhibitor trial. That was not the same molecule that you're looking at. It was the one that's currently being used, right?
Yes, it's donepezil. It's not my molecule. It's donepezil. Yeah. My molecule is several times more effective than the donepezil, and instead of slowing down the atrophy a little bit, I think by having an effective molecule go in there, that it could be a fairly dramatic effect. But now, see, I'm saying this with some skepticism. I'm not willing to jump off the end of the diving board here and say it will. We need to run the experiments.
Yeah. So you found that your molecule can. What do we call these treatments that don't actually fix the disease, but are they stopgap treatments? What?
They're palliative treatments, is what you would call them. They'd be palliative. They're to treat the symptoms.
Yeah.
And the cholinesterase inhibitors were introduced to just treat symptoms. But
And
now that looks like they're the only disease modifying drugs.
yeah, and yours does seem to treat the symptoms better than the current molecules, but you're not yet sure because you haven't done the experiments as to whether or not it actually treats the underlying cause as well.
That's right. I have
Okay.
not done those experiments,
Yeah.
although there was a guy, Cesar Borlangan in Florida, ran an experiment where he gave rats some strokes.
Yeah.
And the purpose of the experiment was to see whether stroke damage could be benefited by a cholinesterase inhibitor.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, he gave the rats some strokes, and then we gave them MIDE molecule, which is MSF. We gave it to them in very high doses,
Mm-hmm.
and it actually preserved some of the cholinergic cells in the brain. It had this beneficial effect. It did not reduce the stroke volume, the volume of tissue that was damaged, but it selectively preserved the tissue that's involved in memory and Alzheimer's disease. So we're real hopeful, but we have to run the experiments.
Yeah, yeah. Because just so people know, if something works on rats, it does not mean it works on humans. So.
Absolutely. But it's better than cell culture.
Yeah, yeah.
I've run the experiments in monkeys also. I've run MSF experiments in mice, rats, and monkeys, and it looks very good in those experiments. And actually, my molecule has been through 3 clinical trials, 2 of which are phase 1 trials, where you give the drug to normal people to see if it's toxic. And then I got to give it to people in a phase 2 trial, and it greatly improved their memory, and it had a lasting effect on the improvement in their memory, much better than the existing drugs.
Yeah.
But my patent is expired and nobody's interested in investigating it. It's one of those on the shelf.
Yeah, yeah. And Dr. Moss has a kind of a funny story too. When he was first looking into this, he wanted to try it on his own dog, and his wife wouldn't let him, so he tried it on himself instead. She was okay with that. Am I remembering the story right?
Yes, but
Yeah.
you've only told half of it, Don. The other half is that after I'd done the experiment on myself, I took the drug for several months and I drew my own blood and had to document what happened and everything. And it was very successful. And I never got sick. I never got nausea, vomiting, or diarrhea. It was very effective. I went to a meeting and I talked to one of my colleagues that works on these drugs, a guy named Elkin Gamzu.
Yeah.
And I was telling Elkin about this, and Elkin said, "Oh yeah," he said, "but you know, when you're developing your drug," I think it was Elkin Gamzu. Don't quote me on it anyway.
Okay.
I think it was Elkin. He said, when you do toxicity studies, don't do them on dogs, because dogs are really sensitive to these kinds of drugs, these cholinesterase inhibitors. Mm. And so, being a scientist, I thought, well, I want to know if it's toxic. And so I think that if dogs are really sensitive to it, that you should do the experiment on dogs. And so I didn't have any money for research, and I certainly didn't have a bunch of dogs at my laboratory. I just had rats. So I went home to my wife, the same as I'd done the night that I explained to her I wanted to do an experiment on myself. I said, you know, I want to do an experiment, and I want to do it on dogs, and I want to use our beautiful Labrador retriever named Frankie. Oh. And Frankie was a lovely dog and was totally compliant. I could give her the medicine. I could take blood from her. I could do all the experiments on her I did on myself, and it would be a great experiment. And my wife said, no. It's okay with me for you to do it on yourself, but not on the dog.
Yeah. I would agree. Like I would rather. I think I'd almost rather do something on myself than on one of my dogs. I'm too attached to my dogs.
Well, Joanne, my wife, her argument is that I understood what I was doing to myself.
Yeah, yeah.
And the dog did not.
Right.
And
right.
the dog did not agree to it.
Yeah, it's almost like dogs are so trusting. It's almost too mean to try something on a dog. It's just Yeah. Sorry, I think I got us off topic here. So, um, we're talking about the approval of this drug through the FDA.
Yes. Well, it turns out that the only problem with my drug was the patent.
Right.
And I did not understand patent law, and I screwed up the patent. I did it myself, and we ran out of patent. But my drug could still be approved without a patent under FDA regulations. Under certain types of it, they could have 5 years of market approval or market protection. But I would like to talk, if I could, John, just a
Yeah.
little bit about what I would do if I ran the FDA.
Okay. Yeah.
If I ran the FDA, a person would come forward with a new drug.
Yeah.
And they would ask for approval. And the first thing that I would require is some minimum evidence that it was not going to harm the people on which it would be tested. In
Okay.
other words, it wouldn't have to be okay with everybody in the whole population, elderly and otherwise sick people and everything. But is there any real probability of significant harm if you tried it on a human being?
Mm-hmm.
And if they brought forward minimum safety data, my interest would be in, does the drug work?
Right.
And so I would have what's called phase X. It would be the first one. Right now, there's a phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. In phase 1, you prove that it's safe for everybody in the world. Phase 2, you show that it has efficacy, it does what it's supposed to. And then phase 3, you replicate on a grand scale what's already 1 and 2. And the drug companies cherry pick the patients they put in phase 3, et cetera. And so it's not all that good.
Okay. So let me try and summarize that. So the way the FDA currently works is you prove it, you think you've got a drug that might be helpful for something. So Alzheimer's treatment in this case. The first thing you have to do is a fairly extensive trial to show that it's not dangerous. Then after that, you can do a trial to show that it works. And you're saying that if you were king of the FDA, you would reverse that. So there's minimal testing for safety first, then there's testing for efficacy, then there's extensive testing to make sure that it's safe for the entire population. And then it would go into trial 3.
I'm going to modify what happens later, but
Yeah.
I would like to make clear to our viewers that phase 1, or the first time you introduce a drug into a human, is really a big step, because up until that time, as John has pointed out, you've tested it in rats, but rats aren't humans. You may have tested it in monkeys, and monkeys aren't human. So the first time you give it to humans, you better be ready for some unexpected effects.
Right.
And if you've tested it thoroughly in rats and dogs, probably you're not going to be surprised, but it's still a big step.
Yeah.
The first in human use is a big step. So if somebody came forward and they tried it on 20 people or whatever, or they wanted to try it on 10 or 20 people and they had good animal data, I would say, okay, try it. Now, the FDA would normally say you have to try this on normal people. I would say, try it on the patients. We want to know if it works. So if it's an Alzheimer's drug, then give it to Alzheimer's patients. Right. Now, I would pick patients that were in otherwise good health. I wouldn't pick patients that had diabetes, that had a history of strokes, that had, multiple sclerosis or heart disease. We want to know if it'll treat the Alzheimer's. That would be phase X. And if it showed a benefit in phase X, it would be in a small group. It would have to be a big effect. In other words, what you would expect to see in the clinic. Are these people going to get better? If it's successful there, then I would run a phase 2 study, still in patients, a bigger study in patients to replicate that. It has to be replicated. Maybe a few hundred patients.
Yeah.
And that could be in a few hundred patients instead of a couple of thousand. and it could be over a year. I think a drug ought to make an effect in a year. I mean,
Yeah.
in Alzheimer's patients, you don't have 10 years to see if the drug's going to make it better.
Right. Right.
And then instead of doing a phase 3, which is 90% of the cost of a drug approval, is running phase 3, where you run it in 3,000 or 4,000 patients over 3 or 4 years, I would go into conditional approval.
Okay.
That is, that you would skip that and in fact put the drug in clinics so that you are treating regular patients that come in, and the drug would be very strictly limited to only the indicated use. There would be no off-label use, and there would be a strict requirement that any untoward effect, any what they call adverse event, had to be reported, and let that be phase 3. Give conditional approval for 2 years. Let it be tried in the clinic, a real clinic, for 2 years and see if it worked. Now notice that I have cut out probably $300 million in the development of the drug, and I've cut off 4 or 5 years of drug development time so that it can come to the market and it can benefit patients early and at a low cost.
Now, it seems like recently there actually has been a bend toward that direction, at least for secondary. So, like hydroxychloroquine, we actually have a question about that as to whether or not you think it actually works. And just so people know, the FDA just on the 15th, the FDA had started allowing the testing, very similar to what you just said, where patients could come in and they could actually get it, but they had to be told by the doctor that it's not approved for COVID-19. This is a drug that people are saying could be used to treat COVID-19, but there's no evidence that it's actually effective. So doctors have been administering it. They tell the patients there's no evidence that this is actually working, but if the patient requests it, they can get it for them. And then they have to report any side effects, and they have to carefully follow the data as to whether or not it's helping the patient. And that was being used in sort of a trial like what you're saying, where it's actually used in the real world. But just on the 15th, the FDA cut that off. They're saying we're not seeing any positive effects. We don't think this is working. So it's that trial is now done. Is that similar to what you're saying? What you think we should be doing?
Well, yes, in a way. The hydroxychloroquine got an emergency use authorization.
Yeah.
That is not drug approval.
Right.
It's an emergency use authorization, and the FDA can allow people to use a drug without going through the whole approval process that I was talking about.
All right.
And in this case, it was very reasonable, because here we are in the middle of a pandemic.
Right.
If a drug is going to work, let's get it to people very quickly. And let's recognize that it's for a disease that has real lethal consequences, real severe health consequences, for which there's no approved treatment. And it could make a big difference. And the FDA will do that on an emergency basis.
Okay.
But you can't get that for normal drug approval for Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or anything else, cancer, things like that.
So you're saying that you would like to see the FDA open that option up to more treatments, even maybe non-fatal diseases.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I should also say that hydroxychloroquine had also been used in humans. So they knew pretty well that it was safe, pretty safe. It had been approved for malaria.
Yeah. So, if we were to open this up, and by the way, there's a lot of people that are pushing for this. They're pushing for looser restrictions on the FDA. This isn't just you, and there's a lot of people pushing for this. If we were to do this, one of the concerns, the concern that I have would be that patients would not be able to tell the difference between a thoroughly approved drug versus one of these kind of like pre-approved drugs. So
excellent.
How would we communicate that to people?
Thank you. I forgot to mention that if I did this and
Mm,
I gave conditional approval for the use of a drug, let's say I was the FDA, it would be in a bottle that was clearly marked,
right.
not approved. It's only conditionally approved, and the physician giving the drug and the patient would have to be notified of that, and the patient would have the choice: do I want to live with my disease the way it is, or do
Right.
I want to take the risk of a drug that has not gone all the way through the approval?
Right.
And so the only way that you could use it is if the patient knew that it had not been fully approved, that it had only been conditionally approved,
Right.
and it would come in a bottle marked that way. And so you could not, as a snake oil salesman, make a bottle like that and say, oh, this is conditional approval.
Right.
I mean, to get conditional approval, you'd have to show that it worked in an
Right.
experiment, that there would be some efficacy, and that there's a good reason to try it.
Right. That what would the incentive be for a doctor there? Because it sounds like the doctor would have to do a lot more paperwork, right? Documenting everything much more carefully than normal. And they might be prescribing something that's not going to be effective or could actually hurt their patient still. And I know that, I mean, a doctor's reputation is important. They got to maintain that. So what would be the incentive outside of an actual clinical trial that's being funded? Why would a doctor even want to do that?
Well, I would hope that it would be a situation where the patient was not receiving adequate treatment with the approved drugs.
Okay.
And it would be an option that the doctor could offer the patient as a treatment. And I think the doctor would be motivated to help their patients, at least make them aware of it. There would be some doctors that probably would not touch a conditionally approved drug.
Right.
There probably would be, and it would probably be in medical schools that they might be more inclined to do it
Yeah.
than in a private
Yeah.
clinic somewhere. And I would hope that the paperwork could be a simple checklist at the end of every 3 months of a doctor's experience, or anytime there's a severe adverse event, that they simply check it off and mail it into the FDA that day.
Yeah.
And the FDA could terminate it immediately if there was a problem.
Right. Right. It's, that does sound very reasonable. We live in a really bizarre moment of history where we've got this new disease that's it's destroying our economy. It's affecting all of us, and at least indirectly. And yeah, it's interesting to see our world kind of go crazy about this, and I'm interested to see where this goes. Super curious. Uh, is there anything else? We're at about an hour and a half now. Is there anything that you want to talk about specifically before we close here on any of your specific research? And then I just want to kind of give a summary, just basic, simple advice for someone who has a disease that's untreatable, what they should do when they are looking at the world of possibly promising new treatments and possible snake oil that's being thrown at them, like what it is that they can do. But before we do that, is there anything else you want to talk about with your specific research on this?
I want to say with Alzheimer's disease that you'll read all kinds of things where Alzheimer's disease is associated with everything. There's a new breakthrough. And even though Alzheimer's disease might legitimately be associated with certain lifestyle changes or lifestyle factors, Alzheimer's is an organic disease in the brain, and we don't yet have a treatment.
Yeah.
I would like to say that as a result of those trials in France that show that donepezil slows the progression of Alzheimer's disease, and by the way, these were in very early stages of the disease. These were prodromal patients. As a result of that, I'm taking donepezil.
Yeah.
But I am in a demographic that is both really sensitive to COVID. I'm 75.
Yeah.
My risk from COVID is very great. My risk of Alzheimer's is great. But I would only take those things that really pass a rigorous review.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you're just wasting your money.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think that's a good summary. So take things that have been rigorously reviewed only. There is insane amount of incentive for people to sell garbage, which is the big problem with alternative medicine, with herbal treatments, is that there's so much incentive to sell something to someone, and it's so easy, especially like a mother with a sick child, or just a husband with a sick wife. These people are going to almost believe anything because they're in this moment of desperation, and it's absolutely horrible, the types of things that end up people getting taken advantage of. And so be very careful when you are in this situation. Please recognize that you are vulnerable, and be very careful, be very guarded. But it is an unfortunate fact of reality that we will get diseases in our lifetimes that there is no treatment, there is no good treatment. And it's just you have to be very careful, you have to be very vigilant to not be taken in by these marketing scams. And yeah, follow the data, read the papers. How is someone supposed to analyze these scientific papers? So we talked about this one on marijuana earlier. Like, how is the public supposed to? The media blows things out of proportion. So what is a person supposed to do when they read about something in the news that might be promising?
Well, first of all, look at where the information is coming from. Don't believe anything on the internet, essentially.
Right.
If it's really good information, you may find that it will be written about by science writers, real legitimate science writers, and they'll have a science writer have an article in Science magazine or in some reputable magazine, some journal. It won't be on the internet. It won't be some guy that found a study or whatever.
Yeah.
Start with that. Those people will review the literature, which sometimes is a little bit impenetrable.
Yeah.
But go to legitimate sources. Go to PubMed, which is the National Institutes of Health Medical Library, and look it up. And you can read the abstracts and see if there's a mechanism of action, and if it's legitimate, and if there are experiments that have been done. And that will help a lot. But generally, don't believe anything in a slick magazine, in a newspaper, or on the internet, because it's just filled with so much BS.
Yeah, well, what if it comes from a popular politician? Which is the problem we're seeing now. I mean, Donald Trump got on TV saying that he takes hydroxychloroquine, which some people are even doubting whether or not that's even true. But he seemed to double down when evidence came out that it was not useful. He, instead of changing his mind, he doubled down. And I mean, this is insane to me. Like, I've never seen anything like this. You've got a politician, very famous politician, who not only doubles down but says that he's using it. Like, what are we supposed to do in this situation?
Don't believe authority. I think I mentioned earlier the appeal to authority. Somebody says it's good. Oh, this guy says it's good. He's an important guy, or she is an important person, doctor, whatever. Use your own mind.
Yeah.
Don't believe stuff.
Okay, so but you say don't appeal to authority, but then you're saying that there are authoritative scientific magazines, and this would come in. It's an authoritative group, so it's a whole group of people that are testing each other's ideas, and that's where you actually get more accuracy.
That's right. I'm saying don't appeal to an authoritative personality.
Right.
The scientific method is where people can see the results for themselves.
Yeah.
And if I publish a paper that runs counter to somebody else's idea, they will run experiments to try to disprove me. Right. And if I'm wrong, it'll be exposed immediately. If I'm right, they have to agree with me.
Right.
And it's through that process that we will find people who have run those studies and have published them in peer-reviewed journals that can speak with authority. That is, they are data-based, they're evidence-based conclusions. It's not before and after, it's real experimental work, it's real data indicate that it works. Then you can have confidence.
Right, right. We've got a couple of questions from viewers here. Rohini asks, is herbal medicine, including homeopathy, better than not natural medicine? So I guess you're saying like mainstream medicine, like, and well, I would say no. It's some herbs can be useful for sure, but the stuff that you get from a doctor has gone through actual clinical trials and has been approved by the FDA, which is this process that we're talking about. So things that have been approved by the FDA have gone through this rigorous research, whereas, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of these herbal treatments have not gone through any sort of rigorous examination. But they might in the future end up going through that and become mainstream medicine.
Yes, I agree. And in fact, a lot of these herbal medicines will give valuable clues that lead to the development of drugs. But I also hear people say, well, it's a natural product and therefore it's safe. And that's not true.
Yeah.
We know a lot of natural products that are not safe. They're very toxic. And the fact that whatever you're dealing with might not be known to be toxic does not mean it's safe. In other words, the absence of data does not mean it doesn't happen.
Yeah, these doctors were drinking their own urine back in the Black Plague days. We now know that's not the best thing to do.
Yeah, but it's not toxic. Probably not toxic.
Sometimes it is. It depends. Yeah. By the way, the World Health Organization recommends that if you drink urine, you need to pasteurize it first. Because actually, drinking urine is used today by many cultures as medicine. So they say that they say that there's no evidence that it works as medicine, but if you do use it, pasteurize it first, which means that you need to heat it.
That's a good idea. Although theoretically, urine from a healthy person is sterile.
Yeah.
Or basically sterile, but you don't know if it's a healthy person or not. Drinking urine is probably not a good idea. Your body's getting rid of all that stuff for a reason.
Yeah. The big problem with it was when MERS broke out, that was coming through camel urine. So people were actually getting a coronavirus through camel urine. And camel urine in cultures where there's a lot of desert travel through camels, there's if you're stranded in the desert, you're going to drink camel urine at some time in your life. And so that had become a traditional use in certain cultures for medicine and for showing how manly you are. You can drink camel urine. And so that was actually their big concern. You need to heat up camel urine to at least 70 degrees before drinking it to kill coronaviruses.
70 degrees Celsius.
Yes, 70 degrees Celsius, yeah.
That's right.
Before drinking it, because that will kill coronaviruses. So yeah, that was a big problem back in whenever MERS broke out. So be careful out there, folks. There's a lot of people that are trying to trick you. They're going to take advantage of you when you are at your most desperate. Learn how to read the literature. Talk to your doctor. Be very careful. So.
Thank you, John, for the opportunity to talk about this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, this is a lot of fun. And yeah, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks.
So long for now, everybody. Stay curious.